Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Network webinar series. Today we are joined by Per Åhlström and Professor Peter Hines. So today Per will be giving an executive overview on the improvement system and how to build a routinized learning capability. So just a bit about the Enterprise Excellence Network for those who are not familiar. The Enterprise Excellence Network is a members-only arena for senior lean leaders based in Europe and was founded by Professor Peter Hines. Before lockdown, it included workshops at best practice host sites, and now we have adapted to do these virtually online. But if you'd like to find out more, my contact details will be in the follow-up email, and you can also visit our website. So just a bit about today. The presentation by Per will be about 30 minutes, and then there'll be a dedicated question and answer session where you can ask your questions using the questions tab for Per. Okay, I will now just hand over to Peter just to say a few words about Per. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Emma, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is for you in your session. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming Per to this webinar session. And Per probably needs no introduction to many of you as one of the outstanding scholars in this area, and with the This is Lean book that he co-authored a few years ago, which was top-selling book, management book in Sweden, and was translated into many countries. He popularized a lot of the lean approach and put it into a sort of language that is understandable and easy for everyone to see in layman's terms, as well as his role as a professor at Stockholm School of Economics. So Per will share with us, following on research from this, which is more around creating a learning system together with a continual improvement around the lean approach. Okay, so with that, over to you, Per, and welcome to the session.
Thank you both, Peter and Emma. First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be with you today. As already presented, what I'm here to share with you today is kind of work in process. It's some ideas that me and my co-author of our book have been and are still developing on as a kind of follow-up from our book, where we're kind of digging deeper into how Toyota in their sales logistics side, how they have realized their famous production system and what we can learn from that. So it's kind of a way to try to decode, in a sense, operational excellence. We're heavily inspired by that, but also we draw some inspiration from some other industries. And the focus really is how do you build a routinized learning capability, which some observers have pointed at being as kind of a core part of what Toyota and other good organizations are good at, to routinely and learn. So that's the focus. And although I'm not able to see you all, I'd like you to join me in a kind of a small experiment, because an analogy that we use when thinking about an organization that has this routinized learning capability is that of driving a car. So I will, in a short while, just show you a video taken inside. It's just one of those YouTube things where someone is driving a car, and I want you to kind of get into the mood and kind of put up your hands and imagine that you are actually behind the wheel. So here we are driving along nice and steadily. We have our hands on the wheel. We have some meeting cars, etc. Now I want you to try an experiment with me. Imagine that this is really you driving. So get yourself into this position and then think about, try closing your eyes. So try to close your eyes. You are driving and now you try to close your eyes. Obviously I can't see you now, so I can't see whether you're actually doing it, but imagine that you were, if you are driving a car, how often, for how long do you want to close your eyes? That's a question. I mean, if you think about it, yeah, maybe quickly, even sneezing sometimes it's a pain when you're driving, but not very long you'd like to close your eyes. least voluntarily, unless of course you're in a fancy Tesla self-driving car. That would take away from this example. But the point here is that when you're driving a car, you never close your eyes, or at least not voluntarily. Hopefully, you never close your eyes. You have your eyes open constantly to be able to make small adjustments, to kind of slow down a bit, maybe accelerate, to turn the steering wheel, be a bit careful when you're overtaking or whatever it is. You're making these constant micro adjustments. Now, compare driving a car with driving an organization. We use that analogy. How do we drive organizations? Well, a lot of people would use the format of driving along, and then once a month you get a report telling you how the previous month that went. Ideally, you get that quite quickly, but maybe even after 6 weeks after it happened, you get this report saying how things went, and then you continue driving. So you have this notion that you kind of close your eyes for 4 weeks, and then you open your eyes, you look at the monthly report, and then you close your eyes again, and then you keep driving the organization. That's kind of a metaphor for what we are trying to decode. This organization that has the ability to have their eyes open all the time and make these micro adjustments. And that's what we are kind of trying to summarize in this model that we're working on. What we call the improvement system model. Is probably a framework, but we call it the improvement system. So we have 4 bubbles and a number of arrows to indicate that this is a system where things are related to each other. But like driving a car, so we have one window more or less. In here we have these 4 windows. We have performance management, flow management, resource management, and improvement management. And I'll walk you through what we mean by this and how it relates back to this building a routinized learning capability. So when it comes to performance management, the key question will be, what's our strategy and how do we ensure that our performance is in line with this strategy? Flow management, how do we ensure that we deliver value to our customers in the best possible way? Resource management, how do we ensure that our resources are maintained, developed, and utilized in the best possible way? And last but not least, how do we ensure that we solve problems and continuously improve in the best possible way? So that's the kind of framework that we are thinking about at the moment as the improvement system. But in order to kind of put that into a bit, not a bigger picture, but to illustrate it, I'm going to use just one case. It's a case that we came across a few years back because it illustrates some of these issues quite well. So imagine a young kid, maybe your son, your brother, your nephew, or whatever, about 10 years old. He's really lively and really wonderful boy, very full of energy and impulsive. But one day you get summoned to his school because the teachers think that there may be something with him, because he finds it quite hard to concentrate, and finds it hard to sit still, often disturbing his friends, and things that he's interested in he gets totally absorbed in, but things that don't catches his interest, he really could not care less about. So the school might think he might be having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and they think it might be a good idea to investigate this further. So you engage in the healthcare system, and this, as all healthcare systems, they might be different, but in this particular case that we came across, the first things that will happen when you try to engage with this particular healthcare system is virtually nothing. It would take at least 6 months before you even start a diagnosis process. And once you're in this diagnosis process, a number of things will happen. So it's the patient in question. It would start with an interview with the parents. There's also a chat with the child, what's called as a functional investigation, when you investigate different aspects of this diagnosis, a psychological investigation, a medical investigation, and then a concluding discussion and a final diagnosis. That's the kind of diagnosis process for ADHD, at least in this particular case. There are slightly difference between systems in terms of what the steps are and in which order they're actually done. But this was the case that we came across. And in like any process, not like in any process, but in many processes, you would find that it's full of waiting time, the red things on the slide. And in this particular case, from first point of contact until diagnosis was 4 months. And you have to remember that they had been at least for 6 months before actually starting this diagnosis process. So up to a year would be a fair average from when you start suspecting that there is something until you find out. Is that efficient? Well, I guess it depends on which perspective you take, but you take this perspective of the patient and his parents. The total time of the green part at the top of the process is actually was in this case 17 hours out of 2,880, 0.6%, not that efficient if you take the perspective of the patient. But probably even worse is that if you truly take the perspective of the patient, sometimes we use the metaphor of a film camera. You put the film camera on whatever it is flowing through your process, whether it's a piece of material, whether it's a customer, whether it's a patient, or whether it's a piece of information in for instance, an R&D process, whatever is flowing through the process. Imagine putting an imaginary camera on that piece that is flowing through the process. If you use that as a metaphor, it probably looks even worse, because then you really start focusing on these different steps. And what it really says is this, because often you don't even know what's going to happen. So it's like a big black box, and then just something happens. It's an interview with a parent. Okay, you get called there. You go there, you go back home, you wait for a little while for the next step, which is to chat with the child. And these steps kind of appear in what is often perceived as more or less a random order from the perspective of the patient and his family members. And maybe you even have to reschedule the medical investigation 3 times because you can't find a joint time where you can all meet. And then there's a concluding discussion. This is kind of how a diagnosis process could look. Well, this is how that particular process looked. And I don't think it's not necessarily much different in a lot of places, at least. But just to illustrate, typically one would say, at least from a perspective of the patient, badly working diagnosis process. And this was the case in the that we came across and that we dug a bit deeper into. But the difference was there that they had one of these really energetic change leaders who really engaged his whole organization into making changes. And this guy Anders, he was one of the dedicated people. And he gathered everyone in his clinic and started asking them questions. So the kind of starting point was that, is this okay? I mean, these are our children, and you wait for 1 year to get a diagnosis. A lot of things will happen in a 1 year period of a 10-year-old's life. So these are our children that we are dealing with. Do you think that this is good quality? And yeah, I mean, they were kind of having to agree to the fact that the medical quality, yeah, no problem, but this is not really that good quality overall. So based on that, and without very little formal training, in lean techniques or whatever you'd like to call them, they started thinking about how to make this better. And he gave them full rein to the people at the clinic, the full rein to do whatever they wanted, as long as one, they were within the legal requirements of what you could do in a clinic like this. And two, they had to inform him once per week what they were up to. And they did a number of things. They started by asking themselves, what's a good investigation? They came up with the idea that it's 7 steps, these steps that I've been talking about. They decided to work more together as one team rather than as separate individuals. They really tried to take, and they did take the parents and child perspective. And they wanted to have as a goal speed and quality. And a common way of working when everyone could see the big picture. That's what they were aiming for. And they managed to reduce this time to 3 weeks. And not only that, what they did during the time, and you have to bear in mind, this reduction in time from 4 months to 3 weeks was done over a period of 6 months only. So they spent 6 months, or they did spend some time planning the changes. They went through the changes during 6 months, and after that, they were able to do it in 3 weeks. And 6 months later, the queue to the clinic was gone. And there was some other interesting outcomes. They were 5 times faster. The medical quality was continued good and very stable. The experience from the point of view of the patients and the parents was a lot better. They checked that with surveys. The staff were less stressed. Employees were more satisfied. More than 100% in increase in productivity at the same time. So really, how is this possible? How can be both faster, better, and cheaper? Well, one way of decoding this is through this lens of the improvement system. So starting out with performance management, what's our strategy and how do we assure performance is in line with it? They started with trying to understand what the demand was. What's the total number of what's the total demand for ADHD investigations per year? And then they broke it down into lesser time periods. They similarly made a study of the supply. How many do we actually do per year? How many visits do we have per year? When we have high and low utilization, etc. And then they kind of started thinking about how to match supply and demand and how to measure performance. They use customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, quality, lead time, and productivity. And this is just an illustration of what the curve looked like. So they went from 65 to 160 investigations per year, corresponding increase in number of visits. Capacity as it increased a bit, but not as much as the volumes increased. So in terms of productivity, about twice as productive as before. So that was the improvement that they went through in terms of performance. Next thing was, one of the key things was to think about the question, how do we ensure that we deliver value to our customers in the best possible way? Well, here, what we call flow management, they started with the question, what is a good ADHD investigation? The goal, high quality and stable short lead time. That was their goal. But how do we get there? Well, everyone developed the best way of working within their part of the flow. So you have different parts of the flow. You have psychiatrist, the counselor, medical doctor, etc. So you have different kinds of people doing different things, but they developed the best way of working within their part. So these 7 different steps, they planned, executed the 7 steps, and then had an evaluation. They looked at how long each part took. So they found out the planning for one case, being a child with suspected ADHD, would take 1 hour, and then the respective steps were timed as the slide shows. And then they developed a common best way of working, which they shared. And then because they were able to do this, well, they divided it up so that they did 3 things during the first week, 3 things during the second week, and the final thing they did in week 3. So that's how they kind of structured the whole diagnosis process. And the result then, as I said, was a fixed throughput time of 3 weeks, 7 steps, and 4 different visits for the parents and the kid. And it took, as I said, in total 3 weeks. Well, what they also were able to do, because of this reduced lead time, they also had fewer patients in process, in a sense. So, whereas they could have 20, 30 patients open at the same time, they had only 5, for instance. And then one of the medical secretaries invented this way of visualizing these patients. So the patients that were currently being investigated were on this whiteboard. These are just, everything here is fictitious, so don't pay no attention to that in terms of the names and pictures. But the point is that because they had fewer patients in process, they were able to visualize the progress of all of the patients. So in week 1, they were able to say that Emil, in this case, had gone through all 3 steps, and then there's a red dot here. I'll come back to that later, but that's a deviation. But you were able to track how they were doing, what the progress. So everyone could see how all the cases they were working on were progressing through the system, which created a lot of benefits. So that's the flow management side. The resource management side then is trying to answer the question, how do we ensure that our resources are maintained, developed and utilized in the best possible way? And an important point here is that the resources need to be available when we need them. So how do they ensure that? Well, here we have a number of 3 people. Again, these are fictitious, and their schedules. Based on what they were, how they have been planning, they needed to find out how and when the first person, the second and the third were working, so that they could actually use that information in order to plan better. I'm just going to click through this. So they started thinking about questioning what's our goal in terms of availability, how do we work together, what structures and systems do we need, who owns the schedule when we plan things, how often do we monitor progress, etc. And that's how they did. So they invented a system for keeping track of all of this as they went through, so that they could visualize what each person was supposed to be doing and how that flowed through. I'm just going to click through here with minimum explanation, just to illustrate. The point here is just to illustrate the flow of things. So every week on Monday they went for weekly management where they plan things. So they plan for week 1, plan what they had to do, and week 2 they planned what had to be done for this particular person, and also for week 3 what had to be done. And then as week they were able to secure resource availability for all steps in the flow, and as the weeks progressed, they had daily meetings when they planned daily management to figure out what are we doing today, and then following on that, kind of moving through the investigation, being able to keep track of both the investigation and this particular child, and also how they were faring in terms of who was doing what, that they were securing that all the different steps were being done in the right order. So that's kind of giving an impression of how they were able to visualize how their resources were utilized and how that led to the progress in terms of the investigation. So that's the resource side. The final side then, or final bubble, is the improvement management, which is of course the core thing here, and that's why it's in the middle. But the question here is that how do we ensure that we solve problems and continuously improve in the best possible way? Well, one of the mechanisms for that was this visualization board, where they could track the progress of a particular investigation, a particular case. And so yes, this is where the color comes in. So you, as long as everything is green, everything is working well. But we were supposed to, in week 2, we were supposed to have covered step 6, but we haven't. It's red. Then we have to deal with that. Hey, there's a deviation here. We need to adjust this. We need to try to understand why is this happening, and we need to improve. That's the kind of mechanism behind the improvement that was supported by this visualization board. They were able to identify deviations and then go into an improvement loop in order to correct that deviation and continue the process. Okay, so that was very quickly, of course. Just a brief overview of what we call the improvement system, which is really a way of trying to decode, in more general terms, in a sense, operational excellence. This is not tied to any particular concept, whether it's lean or Six Sigma or TQM or whatever it is. This is trying to understand essentially the mechanisms behind, but particularly we're interested in the kind of effect of this improvement system. In that sense, here are 4 reflections that we have made around this improvement system. First of all, we could actually observe some patterns in how these capabilities in these 4 different areas were actually developed, because each of these areas kind of signifies an area of capabilities that need to be developed. So how these capabilities were developed is the first reflection. A second reflection is this notion of a self-adjusting system, this system that will automatically turn the steering wheel a little bit to the left when the road is going left. How is that accomplished? The third reflection is this notion of a self-improving system, this routinized learning capability. How does that play in here? And not surprisingly, but also to illustrate a difference between different strategies, the really primacy of the customer in this improvement system. So let me start by this notion of building the capabilities. We have draw it in a slightly different way to make this point. We have flow management, resource management, performance management, and improvement management. What we observed was that there seemed to be kind of a generic sequence that started with, we call it so far understanding, which is kind of understanding how you're working today. What are the ways of working? What are the practices? What does the process look like? And of course, there are lots of tools for this, like value stream mapping, etc. But understanding how you are working in these 4 areas. And again, using the metaphor of a film camera, you can use that to understand. If you look at flow management, you're putting the film camera on whatever is flowing through. If you're looking at resource management, you're putting the film camera on your resources. And if you're concerned with performance management, you're putting the film camera on the performance that you have. Finally, improvement. How do you deal with improvement suggestions? Put the film camera on the improvement opportunity and follow its way through until the problem is solved. And the basis was understanding, and what we call understanding, gathering all the data and clarifying prerequisites, etc. Sorry, the wrong way. Apologies. So first of all, understanding. Next thing was called standardization stroke design. That was kind of designing a better way of working, a best way of working, and hopefully also standardizing that with standard operating procedures. So now everyone knew what to do. So once you had put the foundation, you started standardizing it, designing it in ways of working in a particular way. And then the key thing of visualization, making sure, and this is also important, that we made these observations in a service environment. And one of the things that struck us was how Toyota then worked with visualization in order to visualize all the different aspects of the whole operation. So they visualize the flow, the resource utilization, the performance, and how they work with improvements. All these 4 things are visualized in a very intricate way. So everyone can see everything all the time. Based on that, we call it routinization. They develop a pulse so that everyone can be aware of what the progress is like. How are we doing right now? This is the notion of keeping your eyes open all the time. How are we doing now? Okay, 5 minutes later, how are we doing now? How are we doing now? Not just closing your eyes for 4 weeks, but having your eyes open all the time. And of course, lots of interlinkages between all these different steps. This was kind of a sequence that we observed in which these capabilities were built. And if we break it down, of course, exactly how it's done will depend on whether you're focusing on the flow or whether you're focusing on the resources or performance, but it was a similar kind of structure. That you started by understanding the need, standardize things, visualize things, and then making sure you had control over the progress. So that's kind of the first reflection, that it's kind of an area, or sorry, a sequence in which the capabilities are built. And of course, at the end of the day, it is about making kind of detailed design changes for all of these. And exactly what these changes are will depend a lot on kind of firm you are and the industry, etc. But these were kind of generic observations that we made. Going to move over here. The second reflection was this notion of a self-adjusting system. So this is kind of drawing on these red arrows, this system that as soon as something happened that was a deviation, it could more or less by itself adjust to get back on track. So it's like this loop that you have, a continuous loop that is kind of continuously being in the background, where there's step one when everyone can see what has to be done by who and when, everyone can see that. And then there's an activity, step two, the activity is completed. Step three, everyone can see that the activity is completed because it's the dot is green, for instance. So it's like a continuous loop that just continuously and almost subconsciously lying in the background, making sure that everything is fine until there is there's something red, when something is not the way it's supposed to be. Because it's all routinized, it's all visualized, everyone can see that, and people can more or less automatically adjust rather than waiting for something. You can see directly that something is wrong and then you adjust. Of course, you can recognize this in a lot of different applications, but that's the kind of idea of the self-adjusting system, that is continuously adjusting. So in the particular case that it's presented, is this notion of this this dot is red. Hey, why haven't we completed this particular step? We need to do it directly, and then going back to green. The third reflection, and it's nearly done. The third reflection is this notion of a self-improving system. So what if it's not possible just to adjust? What if it's a real problem? It's not kind of just turning the steering wheel slightly. You have to actually solve a bigger problem, or it's an improvement idea. That's where this middle bubble or capability kicks in. Hence the red arrows pointing to that. That's where you get into another kind of loop where having defined the standard way of working, visualized and used the standard, someone identifies irregularity, you're into this, it's got a lot of different names, this problem-solving loop, but the idea here is that it's used to indicate that it's more or less a routinized thing to go through this loop. So as long as everything is green, everything is just going on as normal. But as soon as something is identified as an irregularity, something that needs improving, then you're kicked into this problem-solving cycle. And you, of course, try to get to the root cause of the problem. And interestingly, what we observed also was that this kind of problem-solving loop exists on different levels. So in Toyota's distribution system, at the lowest level of the workshop, there's one loop, but then higher up, if there's a problem at the lower level and it's not solved within 24 hours, then the next level we kick in and come and ask, how can we help you? We see you had the problem 24 hours ago and you haven't solved it. How can we help you? So this kind of routinized problem-solving loop is existing in different layers. And last but certainly not least, this primacy of the customer. And that's really important here. And in our previous book, we make a distinction between resource efficiency and flow efficiency. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just the idea that resource efficiency is in any process is kind of looking at the resource. So it's looking at it's filming the value source or the doctor in this case, and you're trying to maximize capacity utilization by keeping resources busy, what we call resource efficiency. The distinction is clear to what we call flow efficiency, putting the camera on the value receiver or the patient in this case and trying to maximize the share of value adding time on that film that is filming his particular journey through the diagnosis process. And it's clear, very clear here that flow efficiency is super critical. So this would be the way in our improvement system that it would look like, that the strategy is clear, it's flow efficiency. It's making sure that the customer is receiving value for as much time as possible. So the first task then would be, or the second, given that we have a strategy of flow efficiency, we need to secure the flow and then ask ourselves, how do we ensure that resources are available? This is a regular resource efficiency strategy, would mean that we have a strategy of securing resource utilization. That means that we will need to secure availability of cases rather than the other way around. So important difference here is that you start with flow and then you secure the availability of resources. So that's the notion of the improvement system, but what you often find in organization that it looks something like this. You start out in performance management. Often you measure cost, productivity, probably quality, maybe lead time. And then the idea is that you have to work harder to keep our resources busy. And by the way, you need to improve, but the direction is more, you can do better than that, rather than giving any kind of true direction to the improvements. So last slide, just a summary. So this is, again, point out, it's work in process in our attempt to kind of decode what we have observed, particularly at Toyota in their service operation, but also gleaning some other thoughts from other cases that we have come across, more than I just presented. I just chose one of those cases as a way to illustrate or articulate a more concept-independent way of looking at, in a sense, operational excellence. What you can do in order to build this routinized learning capability, this notion that you're constantly learning and it's kind of inbuilt. It's kind of part of the whole system, that it's kind of geared towards making sure that there's always, if there's a deviation, there's a correction, and if there's a problem or a bigger deviation, there's a involved into the whole system is this idea of continuously improving. I think I'll stop there. Well, I will stop there. Probably just a few minutes too much, but I'll stop there, and I'm more than happy to take questions, etc. So I will stop sharing my screen as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Per. It's Peter back again. Very interesting, and similar to your This is Lean book, you've taken a complex topic and made it quite simple and understandable, which is great. So what we'll do now is we have the opportunity to ask some questions. So in order to do this, if you'd like to pose any questions that you have in the questions box on, you'll see that on the right-hand side in the tab area, and then I can post those to Per and he can answer.
Yeah.
So while you're thinking, perhaps I can ask sort of Per. So where are you in writing this up or publishing this new work? Is this Still in process,
Yeah.
or
It's still in process. We started looking at it a few years ago, but then some things happened in around our own processes that it was put on hold. But we're kind of getting back on track on trying to write it up. So hopefully we will write it up in the form of a book. We're struggling a bit because when we wrote the first book, we had kind of the ideas already ready, so we worked very hard on trying to formalize them or formulate them in a pedagogical way. The thing we struggled with here first was that we had to work on the ideas at the same time as we tried to work on how we present it, and that kind of got a bit complicated. So we're hoping to write it up as a book. We're also hoping to write it up in a more academic way as well.
okay.
Part of it at least. So the idea is to write it up, hopefully.
Okay, well that all sounds good. As I'm presently writing a paper at the moment, I know how long it takes to write academic papers, and
yeah, we haven't quite started yet, but I have an idea of what we can do, so hopefully it should work.
Yeah,
presenting it in a few academic conferences, but in a slightly different way, of course. But
right.
Underlying data.
So on the framework that you develop, I was trying to write it down. You had understand, standardize and design, visualize. I'm not sure what the last one was.
Routinization.
Oh, routinization. That's, I guess, a sort of PDCA type of cycle.
It is sort of I mean, a lot of this stuff it's very similar, or maybe it is even PDCA. So it is a cycle, but I think two things which is slightly different is this visualization.
Okay. Yes.
Which I think when we had a quick chat before, and you talked about what they were doing at Toyota in the UK, and maybe that's similar to this.
Yes.
Having a lot of stuff visual. And then a slightly different thing might also be this routinization, where you develop, which is kind of in manufacturing, it's kind of inbuilt in the process that it's visual, that it's routinized.
Yeah.
It becomes less so in services, and that's what we found so fascinating. They're kind of emulating manufacturing in services in order to keep track of things.
I mean, one of the problems I see here on the visualization, I guess, is that these are remote places. The doctors are in different specialist functional areas in the hospitals.
This particular one, they were physically gathered together.
Okay.
This particular case, but yeah, of course, that is an added complication in a lot of services.
Yeah. So, but I mean, you could. I mean, I've been exploring this whole field of the next generation improvement that, a lot of us are working at home, and even after COVID, we're still going to be working at home to some degree. And, like doing this type of work, particularly in service, we will be in different locations, difficult areas. So how do we cope with this in a physical environment? How do we use digitization and so forth to support that?
Yeah, and I mean, there are tools being developed for that. I know though that my co-author Niklas, he is very active in the construction industry, and through him they're working on using a similar way of thinking in construction, but digitally. So you have different platforms, but this one is called Miro.com, where you work. That's one way of doing it. But it will be interesting to see what ways we can develop in order to kind of mimic this being able to be at the same time and see everything at the same time.
I think, Miro, I use myself actually sometimes in running, open workshops. So you can actually do a sort of tableau on like this sort of forum, and you can get people interacting and so forth, which I think would be quite effective. So I don't know. I think some of these tools will become more commonplace for us. Anyway, we got a question here from John, who sort of builds on this visualization area. So what he says is, how do we get people excited about visualization when people are desk bound? So what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I guess it's very much related to what you were saying. I think before I try to answer that question, I'm not sure I can answer it. It's a very good question, but one thing that I like to say about visualization is that visualization stroke information systems is that there's a tendency sometimes to, from this perspective, misuse information systems. So that you think that as soon as you put it into an information systems, it's available, but it's not necessarily. So what we found is that what Toyota did was that they used the walls. So yeah, obviously this is a drawback. Well, it is a drawback in a lot of occasions, but the idea is that it's different when you see it around you rather than it's available in the information system and you can access it. But this added complication of having to access this and knowing where to look it's maybe one hurdle towards visualization. So maybe that's part of the answer. How do you develop a way in which it's not a problem to access the information? But yeah, when you are desk bound or you are dispersed, that will make it and does make it harder, definitely.
I mean, you know, going back to things like the Miro and there are a number of other tools like that, you can just have a dashboard on your laptop and it just click on it every hour or so and just or you know, you can have an and-on signal if a red appears, you know, it can be done quite easily, sort of thing.
I think so. I think there's tendency sometimes to overcomplicate it. I think the idea is to do it simple in a way that people understand it. And it doesn't necessarily have to make sense to someone outside the organization, but as long as people working with it understand it.
Yeah.
My in that respect, it is part of visualization, but I observed in one hospital, I thought it was really innovative in a very low tech way. But you had two standard thing. You had two departments or clinics, so one has to send patients to the other, and before they can send patients to the next, they have to have beds available. So how do you synchronize that? And you can have a very complicated system. But what they did was that this department had a whiteboard where they did all the daily planning, and then they just put a webcam on that whiteboard so that they could log on and see what the whiteboard looked like. And then, well, they seem to have a bed ready at 12 o'clock. Let's aim for 12 o'clock.
Can be very easy, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be complex.
Question here from Stephen. So he says, in understanding the current patient treatment state and exposing the activities that consume time but add no value, how did you help the client design the new future system? Was it a process of discovery for them, or did you give them the answers to work to?
I'd like to emphasize that this is a case that we came across, not as consultants or anything. They'd done it all by themselves. So the interesting thing was the head person had a 2-day standard lean training and then went back home to his clinic, just gathered his staff and just asked them a simple question: is this good quality and what can we do better? And he didn't really provide that much direction, and that in itself is interesting. They didn't, although he had formal lean training, they didn't work according to a particular format or concept as such, but it's more clever people knowing their own operation, being given the freedom to come up with improvements that took them in this direction.
So it's a sort of self-discovery and co-creation approach.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And that tends to be a very, very powerful. Of course, this is a limited setting and in one sense very, very simple process, but still.
And you said you've done a number of other cases that you've been looking at. You know, this was an illustrative case to show this. Does it very much follow the same sort of logic and thinking that you've developed?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. You can we have used this framework to understand various phenomena, whether it's agile software development at Spotify or whether it's in manufacturing or in construction. It is what we're hoping for, at least, that it's a more generic way of understanding improvement, which is kind of concept independent. Of course, you can put a lean layer on this and see a lot of different tools that would fit in, or any other concept. But the idea is that to make it concept independent and think about the generic issues around it from our point of view, operational improvement. So it's not necessarily an enterprise excellence, but at least operational excellence. But the idea is also not only concept independent, but also in a sense process independent. You can put this on any process within the firm.
I'm also thinking of how could you codify and share the learnings, and I'm not just think within the team, but outside the team. I mean, how could the hospital take this idea in this example and use this in many other cases?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. I guess what you need to share then is the generic things, not the details of exactly what was done and the exact tools, but rather maybe the sequence in which things were done, how you were working with the improvements, maybe also thinking of it in these kind of boxes, thinking about starting with the customer, understanding what does the customer need. Given that, how do we ensure that all the resources are available? So it's probably I'm sort of sharing at that level, but how to do it? Yeah, that's a tricky one.
I'm sort of thinking of applying the sort of Toyota thinking, because they'd be straight onto the yoga tent sort of thing with this and saying, how do we share this, in the horizontal way? So how do other teams benefit from this knowledge? And maybe it's as you say in your answer, if where you're adding value by codifying what did they actually do and the steps, so you could share the case and say, this is what we did, this is how we did it. If you want to replicate it, think about how it's been done and what would it actually mean in your case, and then it's a sort of co-creation exercise for the other teams.
There's a lot to be said for that, because it tends to be kind of, well, I guess it's pedagogy that you tend to learn a lot better when you're kind of exploring things yourself within a certain framework, rather than being told exactly what to do. You're left to explore things yourself. And the interesting thing was that the study on which we're basing our insights, it really started out with Niklas then trying to understand how TPS was used in services. But when he asked that question to the people inside Toyota, they couldn't answer. Because it's not like it's a toolbox that they apply. What we had to do was to observe what they were doing and then ask them, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And then kind of gradually getting to underlying ideas, because you can't ask the question, how do you apply just in time in services? Because they don't know, they just do. So that's kind of this tacit thing, that they're just doing things without really reflecting on, well, they're reflecting on why they're doing it, but not what they're doing in terms of, is this that tool or that tool? That's not the way they think.
Yes.
So that also speaks for sharing knowledge at a different level, rather than just saying exactly what you did, rather how we did things, and maybe also why you did things.
Yeah. I'm sort of going through my mind some of the work that I've done and applying that into your case here. So
you're the expert here, so I'm sure.
Oh well, no, I'm expert in bits, but not everything. So I'm thinking of things like you talk about standardizing. Here we're standardizing at the sort of work level, etc. What about some of the sort of leader standard work that this might come out of this? So it's actually almost systemizing that diary planning process that you were looking at, of saying, well, we have 15 minutes at the beginning of every day, and then we maybe have 2 till 4 for appointments with with patients, and trying to turn this into some wider systemization.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an interesting aspect of it. Of course, this whole notion of standard work, and it's actually also used within services. So, but there's a difference there. Is you don't always standardize content, but you standardize the form. So for instance, for every customer meeting in the sales, in car sales, they would have a standard for how long they should interact with the customer, and kind of start by asking a set of questions with the purpose of finding out what the customer could potentially want. So they didn't delineate exactly what questions to ask, but they had a standard of saying that spend whatever it was first 6 minutes talking to the customer in order to find out. So they actually standardize even in very contact intensive non-standardizable services. They had a standard, but at the form level rather than the content level. And it's of course always kind of related to be able to improve, because if you have a standard, you can improve it, and that's part of it. So it's I think one of the challenging aspects in services, particularly in professional services, is to get people to do things in a fairly similar way.
Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges, I mean, you talk about the car industry. I did some work many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, looking at applying lean into a car dealer myself with some Italian colleagues. And what we found was if you started by understanding the needs of the customer, the salespeople selling cars or used cars, or the service repair maintenance people had a complete misunderstanding of the needs of the customer. They knew what the customer wanted, but it wasn't what the customer wanted. So, maybe the starting point was actually understanding the needs of the customer. In this case, in your case, you've taken the implicit need for a shortened lead time, which obviously was, a key need in this particular case. I'm just sort of thinking around whether there might be other needs that we can bring in and so forth.
No, but I completely agree. It all starts in understanding the needs of the customer. And in this case, there was a particular need for not spending a year until finding out that your kid had ADHD. If it could be done in 3 weeks, there are probably other ways in which you could further improve, but that was kind of a very low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. Well, it's been really interesting to hear from you and to have a chat and a few questions from the audience there. So I think time is sort of against us, and we're sort of just about at our hour period. So so thank you very much, Per, for that presentation. And
thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
We all look forward to seeing the new book, but it sounds like it won't be in the next few months, unfortunately.
No, I'm afraid not, but I look forward to it as well.
Very good, very good. So hand over to Emma to finish us down for the day.
Thanks, Per. Thanks, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for attending. So you will receive a e-certificate, a virtual certificate in your follow-up email, along with the webinar recording. And look out for the upcoming websites on our website as well, the enterpriseexcellencenetwork.com. So thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, and take care.
Great. Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Have a good day.